Hello, Morim here. Today with a build so busted, I'm worried it will get nerfed after this video. We're going to combine the Great Staff of the CRONE with the Nature's Fury Keystone to instantly reset the cooldown on our Trample and Bulwark, which in turn resets the cooldown on Hurricane and Cyclone armor. This in turn has a chance to reset the cooldown of Trample and Barrier. A feedback loop. Under normal circumstances, this would mean a 20% chance per use. But we also have the CRONE Staff, which changes the Claw skill to a Storm skill and casts an additional instance of Storm Strike. This Storm Strike seems to proc the Nature's Fury Keystone, giving us not only a much faster attacking and claw ability, but also a second chance in the same cast to proc Nature's Fury. This makes it so you basically do not have any downtime on any of your skills. We have permanent vulnerable uptime, permanent vigilance uptime, which is a 15% damage reduction, permanent hurricane uptime, which is another source of 20% reduction, get 20% from the basic skill damage reduction aspect, as well as 25% from the Storm Strike. We have basically permanent uptime on Unstoppable, and have a barrier up that's worth 4 to 5k, which is reset constantly. Whenever we reset it, it deals damage. At the same time, we are constantly trampling and CCing enemies, making them unable to move due to immobilize, knockback, stunned or slowed. And those that get an abuse immunity do not have it any better due to us trampling over them constantly, crushing them with an obscene amount of landslide pillars. Those do not disappear after casting another trample, they stay and overlap. And to top everything off, we are also constantly healing due to the masochistic spirit boon. Now there's a lot more mechanics to this, like for example overcharge, proccing on every tick of hurricane, on every landslide hit, on every normal hit, no matter what, it procs the overcharge. We are also constantly resetting trample, meaning we get the 150 additional damage to bosses. And trample is a earth skill, so it benefits from all our damage scaling. All of this means we delete everything. We speed through dungeons, completely obliterate bosses, are extremely tanky and have insane sustain. To prove my point, you will be able to look at extended gameplay at the end. I will showcase uncut content, so I'm not cherry picking anything. I also do not run super juiced gear, like I already mentioned, so what you're seeing here is very easily replicated. And I'm going to include an option to play this one without the CRONE Staff, because it is possible, however not that good. So next I'm going to quickly go over gear, mechanics, then the Spirit Boon, Skilltree and the Paragon Board at the end. You can find the planner in the description box. So I'm going to start with the gear. First, the most important thing and the most important piece of this gear is the CRONE Staff. This one enables your claw skill to become a Storm skill and also casts, it specifically says cast, a Storm Strike. For this, when we look at the keystone, it specifically tells you when casting a Storm skill. So it should proc, and given my testing, I am very certain this one works. Next, let's look at the helmet. For the helmet, we are rocking attack speed on basic skills, cooldown reduction, health on kill, and another mod. For this one, I highly recommend the total armor one, because armor is completely busted and one of the most broken stats in the game. Resistances are completely useless, and damage reductions are also essential. So combining damage reductions with your total armor mods will make you insanely tanky and basically invincible. For the aspect, we are rocking the Nature's Fury one. So whenever the Keystone Nature's Fury triggers, it decreases the cooldown of our non-ultimate abilities by 8 seconds. When I look at my cooldowns with the cooldown reduction I currently have, so 13.5% on this one and 11.8% on this one, we are rocking 13.7 seconds, Trample is at 10 seconds, 10.69, ooh, nice, Queen 69, Hurricane at 15.27, and Earthen Bulwark at 12.22. Meaning we only need to hit enemies one time and get basically all our cooldowns back. Sometimes the cooldown decreases 2 times, since we are always proccing the keystone. So it helps a little bit, but it's not the most essential stat on this one. Attack speed is. I just like it for more consistency. Next ammo, go for damage reduction. Life, another damage reduction mod, damage reduction while fortified is extremely strong on this build. We have fortify up all the time, so we are basically always full on fortify. We can also get total armor on this one. Total armor is again extremely strong on this build, extremely strong on any build. And for the imprint, we are going to go with the basic skill grants 20% damage reduction for 6 seconds. So another instance of basically total damage reduction. It's also a high value, so not something like 10%, which is much worse than just 10% plus 10% or even 5% plus 15%. So 20% is exceptional. For our gloves, I'm rocking ranks to landslide and critical strike chance. The other two mods are basically completely dead. I don't need lucky hit chance, I don't need critical strike damage with lightning skills. I'd much rather prefer critical strike chance with earth skills. Attack speed can also roll on those gloves with 15% at I think the second highest roll. And we can also get intelligence or dexterity to get our Paragon Board to function at the most efficiency. Because when we look at the Paragon Board, we have specific nodes, like for example here, that require more dexterity and willpower than we can get through the Paragon Board. If we don't specialize with additional stats in this one, we cannot get those. But you need to think about what do you gain from additional dexterity, additional willpower. Because when we look at this one gives 15 crit damage. The next one here gives another 15% crit damage. We can also get 4% damage reduction. We can also get 10% storm skill damage, which is only affecting our claw and storm strike. So you need to think about what you want stat-wise on your gear. Next, let's have a look at our pants. Our pants are rocking as much damage reduction as possible, with damage reduction to fortified and damage reduction flat. Both of those have priority over damage reduction versus distant or close enemies. We are rocking already a lot of damage reduction, so it's not that effective. I would much rather have, instead of the damage reduction versus distant enemies, ranks to trample, because I already have ranks to hurricane on this one. Both of those will deal substantial amounts of damage if you stack them. Remember, we get a 150% increase to the damage we deal on single target fights. So when we reset our trample and trample through bosses, they are getting hit by this. And trample is an earth skill, so the modifier on this one is insane. Next for the boots. On the boots, I'm going for movement speed and intelligence as well as willpower. I want to have as many stats as possible here. The dodge chance is nice, but not really that beneficial to this build. We are already extremely tanky, so I would much rather prefer to have dexterity on this one. I also forgot the imprint on the pants. We are rocking the disobedience one. We deal a lot of ticks, a lot of small damage ticks with our hurricane, with our TRAMPLESLIDE, with our barrier. All of our damage increases our armor by up to 50%. This can get you to around 7k armor, 7.7k armor, which is a massive damage reduction to physical and at half the value. Now as for the boots, I'm going with Ghost Walker. We are constantly unstoppable, so we get a 25% increase to our movement speed, and we move freely through enemies, which is an extreme benefit to this build. We are basically not stopped by anything. Next I will go over the rings first, because I already talked about Hurricane and TRAMPLESLIDE and all the hits we deal. With the overcharge band, so an overcharge aspect, we can get this one on the codex. We are getting a lucky hit chance to apply a debuff to our enemies. This one deals lightning damage, but we scale elemental damage anyway, and a lot of critical strike damage that is flat. So we have a guaranteed chance to deal damage after the application. This damage procs per tick, meaning every instance of our damage, every small tick is triggering this. If you trigger 50 hits in 1 second, the 4.6k damage you see here is applied 50 times. This makes this specific aspect extremely strong on this build. And by extremely strong, I mean completely busted on this build. No amount of more multiplier, for example the Fortify multiplier, that caps at 40%, is going to outweigh this damage increase. So we want the overcharge aspect. And one tip, the overcharge aspect scales with a level. So when you go to the occultist and enchant this on your gear, you're going to have more benefit from the aspect you find in the codex than the one you find on the gear. Because when we look at the one we find on gear, right here, we have a 12% chance to apply less than half damage. You would need to find an ancestral max power item level 1 to benefit from the increase to the chance. The second ring is going with the landslide earth pillar one, so each earth pillar strikes again. When we trample, it repeats. And for the amulet, we're going with the TRAMPLESLIDE aspect. So a trample summons landslides, landslide pillars. So the keyword here is landslide, not the landslide pillars. It's 6 landslides that expand outwards of our character. And when we dash forward with our trample, we repeat this sequence. So when you dash further, you're going to repeat the sequence up to 6 times. So it's 6 times times 6 times. So you have a massive, massive area of effect that is applied that deals the damage. And this one is multiplied by what you see here. This multiplier multiplies the normal damage. But what does normal damage mean? I tested this one. So I went to the ability. I spec'd out of it. I spec'd out of wild impulses. I spec'd into wild impulses. I spec'd into landslide. Tested this at different stages. And noticed the landslide you hardcast always deals the same damage that the landslide you get from the trample. But only if the landslide is on a bar. Is it going to benefit from the modifier? So if you have a primal landslide and you do not have your landslide on the bar, you're not going to benefit from the terror modes. But the damage scales. So keep that in mind. Now as for the stats, my jewelry is complete trash. We have crit strike chance and vulnerable damage on this one, which is exceptionally beneficial for us. Vulnerable damage is a multiplier to all our damage. We apply it constantly through Cyclone Armor. Cyclone Armor resets and applies a 3-second vulnerable debuff on any enemy it hits. We also apply it through Claw and the Storm Strike, because we spec into the Storm Strike that applies vulnerable, not the one that changes further, because the one that changes further doesn't benefit our damage at all. We want to apply vulnerable constantly. So this means the other stats on this ring are not that beneficial. Instead of lightning damage, I wouldn't even want physical damage, but I would want damage versus close enemies to scale both our damage types. And for the crit damage, I would want crit damage flat. Not crit damage with lightning skills, not crit damage with earth skills. I would want crit damage. This is true for both rings. And as you can see here, this ring is even sacred. It's under 700 item power. We have a bad vulnerable roll, we have a bad crit chance roll, we have damage versus distant enemies, and we have crit strike damage. So the damage versus distant and damage versus close. What do I mean by that? We are knocking back enemies. So the damage versus distant is not that bad. Distant means enemies further than this line here apply this damage modifier to the damage. If enemies are close to you, basically in this radius around your character, you apply damage versus close. Very easy to understand. That's about all you need to know. As for the amulet, this one is the most difficult to get right. We have earth skill damage, which is not benefiting both our damage types. But we have ranks to wild impulses, which is a 15% damage multiplier. We can also roll basically every passive on our passives tree. We can roll Defiance, we can roll Natural Disaster, we can roll Resonance. All of those can be simultaneously on your amulet. So if you get 2 of them or even 3 of them, it's mind-blowingly good. That multiplies you can roll on a gear. The cooldown reduction you find here is fine. It helps you with the build. It helps with consistency since we are not rocking Symbiotic on our amulet. Instead, we are rocking Trampled Earth because we get the multiplier here. So the cooldown reduction helps. And we don't even have flat movement speed here. We have the movement speed after killing an elite here. Now, Trample is a movement skill, so we are not that dependent on the flat movement speed we have on our gear. I would still prefer the flat movement speed here to get to 75% basically permanent movement speed because we are rocking Ghostwalker. So it's 25% here, 25% on the boots, and 25% on the amulet, which results in 75% flat. And potentially you can move the movement speed after killing an elite to the boots instead of, for example, the dexterity or intelligence or willpower, depending on what you don't need. Now, with the gear summed up, we are going to go over consumables first, because consumables do offer you a substantial boost in power. We have, for example, Elixir of Savagery, which increases the crit strike damage by 25%. You want to use some kind of elixir because of the 5% experience gain. And what I really like to use, and you can craft this one, is the potent Iron Barb elixir because of the armor we get. 400 armor doesn't seem all that much, but when we unequip our rings with 220 armor in our sockets, we decrease our armor to 39% damage reduction. When we equip them, that's 6% more damage reduction. It scales linearly. So armor is exceptionally strong, especially since we are also using this disobedience aspect, which boosts the armor further. Now, speaking of gems, skull gems in your jewelry, sapphire gems in your equipment. In your weapon you want to use emeralds for crit damage to vulnerable enemies. Next we're going to look at the spirit boons. For the spirit boons, go with wariness for the deer. For the eagle we are going with scythe talons for a 5% crit strike chance increase, which is substantial to this build. And avian wrath for 30% more crit strike damage. For the wolf we are picking bolster because all other options are useless to us. And for the snake we're going to run masochistic to get our sustain up and running. Because whenever we use a claw, this counts as a shapeshifting skill. Trample the same. So when we crit with those, we heal. All other options are mediocre at best or even useless. Next we are going to look at the skill tree. We max out claw, but that's a joke. We don't touch claw, we only put 1 point in this one since this one is basically dealing no damage. We pick up enhanced claw for 10% more attack speed, and we get a 10% chance to attack twice, which procs storm strikes 2 times. So we have 3 depending on, or 4 casts depending on if this one casts double or if this one is just a damage increase. But we do get 2 storm strikes off. So storm strike is dealing a lot of damage, and we get fierce storm strike to apply vulnerable to targets. We then pick up predatory instinct for another increase to our crit chance. We get wild impulses for more damage. We get landslide for more damage with our landslide pillars when we take 5 points out, so 4 points out. We get a 40% decrease in our damage, so having more points is always better. We pick primal landslide for the terror mode, so when we landslide, or trample in this case, we're going to summon a lot of landslides. Those crit or touch enemies that are immobilized or stunned, because when we knock a target into a wall, they get stunned. So when our landslide then hits, we get terror modes, which then guarantee critical strikes, and those critical strikes deal a little bit less critical strike damage, but scale exceptionally well with crit anyway. Next we go into the defensive cluster. We pick up Earthen Bulwark with Unstoppable and Inner Earthen Bulwark, because whenever we recast our Earthen Bulwark or this one expires, it deals damage around us. This one scales with physical damage because it's earth, so it's very beneficial to our build to have this additional instance of damage. We then also pick up Cyclone Armor with the node Innate Cyclone Armor to get vulnerable up on enemies. So whenever we cast our Earthen Bulwark, we have a chance to also cast Cyclone Armor since we are also using Nature's Fury. And we get resets on our Storm skill, so we can cast Cyclone Armor frequently, which then applies vulnerable to our targets around us. We don't care about knocking back enemies because we are knocking back enemies all the time anyway. And we then have Vigilance. Vigilance gives us 15% damage reduction for 6 seconds after using a defensive skill. Both of those are defensive skills. We are spamming them, so we are constantly reapplying the 15% damage decrease. We ignore the companion cluster. Then we go into the Hurricane. Hurricane has 100% uptime on this build, so we don't need this node, Endless Tempest. We go for Enhanced Hurricane to get a slow, and we want Hurricane applies a damage reduction to enemies. So that's another 20% damage reduction to enemies. Very strong, very nice to have. Next is Trample. We max Trample. For this one we sacrifice Safeguard, 1 point in Safeguard and 1 point in Predatory Instinct. So we don't max out Predatory Instinct because this one is just much better. We get a 150% damage bonus on trampling. So when we trample through a boss, a single target, we apply this damage. This multiplies the 10k that you see here by that 150%. And we also get Fortify whenever we trample, so we are always full on Fortify no matter what. We get 10% through defensive uses, and we get 22% through this one, through the trample. And trample resets all the time, so we get fortified. We then want Crushing Earth for a 10% damage multiplier versus slowed, stunned, immobilized, knockback targets. This is a mix between the crit you want from the Predatory Instinct node and this one. This one applies only versus CC'd enemies, the other one only versus close enemies. So it's preference here. It's basically not possible to calculate this for me right now. If we get very good planners, we can calculate this one online or in something like PoE Builder. But what I do know is Stoneguard is busted. We get 12% increased damage to our Earth skills when we are fortified. So 50% fortify is very easy to reach on this build. So this one is basically up all the time. Since this one has a condition, we are not going to benefit from this one when we start the dungeon, but basically every encounter after this one is going to apply this. Then we go for Defiance, max this one out. Natural Disaster, max this one out. Enemies are always vulnerable, so we get a massive increase to our damage. Same for the Storm skill portion. We are always stunning, immobilizing, or knockbacking our enemies, so we get another boost to damage. And Resonance. We are constantly using Storm skills and Earth skills. So this one should apply at the triple bonus, so 18% all the time. Every trample should benefit from this. Nearly every Storm Strike, nearly every Claw is going to benefit from this. And of course, Nature's Fury, our keystone. So basically every time we use an Earth skill or Storm skill, the other damage type is going to become a free skill at 20% chance. This one doesn't scale with lucky hit chance. This one is a 20% flat amount and is triggered on cast. So not on hit, on cast. Next, let's go over the Paragon Board. For the Paragon Board, we're going to go with the Exploit start here. We apply Exploit on every target we hit the first time. We get a lot of vulnerable damage from this board, and we don't apply vulnerable from this glyph for 20 seconds. But we have a lot of instances, so we don't really care after this. We then path to the next board, which is the Constricting Tendrils one. This one has a lot of available dexterity, so we can use the Spirit glyph here. This one gives us critical strike damage with core skills. Basically, all our landslides are benefiting from this, and every crit strike is also increasing the damage they take from further damage by 2% per crit. So up to 6 crits can increase this one to 12%. We get a ton of maximum life here. We get a ton of natural magic skill damage here. We can also grab this cluster a little bit later to fill out our damage, because we get damage versus elites, damage with nature skills, damage versus elites also here. And this one is very cheap to get. And the next board is going to split into two ways. First, we path down here to the bottom. So we path through the maximum armor and maximum life. We pick up Determination. Determination is going to get boosted by the next glyph. This glyph is Outmatch. So all rare nodes are boosted by a certain amount, a certain percentage. But we also increase the physical damage we deal by a 16% multiplier. A 16% multiplier to physical damage applies to Landslide and Trample and our Hurricane and our Cyclone, because all of those are physical damage, not lightning damage or earth damage. There is no earth damage. We need 25 dexterity in range. This is only reachable in this position for this glyph if you have this glyph at 15. If you only have the range of 3, you're not going to benefit from this. But this also buffs the armor of this node. As I already mentioned, 390 armor, that equals to around 6% mitigation to physical damage and 3% to non-physical damage, so it's a very strong node. We then path through here to get the attack speed node. This board is located here because of this, because we get the bonus here. So the most benefit from this board is given through the rare nodes, and that's why we also pick Outmatch for this one. We get attack speed all around here, 1.3% for the magic nodes, and 5%. Since we get the threshold, we get another 2.5, so it's 5%. So the next board, we are going to attach this Thunderstruck board, because we get vulnerable damage up here, crit damage, and vulnerable damage, very strong nodes. We also deal a lot of Storm skill damage, so Hurricane, Cyclone Armor, Claw, and Stormstruck benefit from this one. We also always apply Vulnerable and Immobilized, so the 30% increase and multiply to all our crits is going to apply. So if it's not buffing our landslide damage, but buffing our Storm skill damage. We then have another crit damage multiply here with those nodes. Those are also unconditional, so they also apply to our landslides. Very good. And we pick up the glyph slot here. This glyph slot requires 40 willpower, which we get through a variety of means. And we get a boost to the damage reduction from vulnerable enemies. This one also only boosts magic nodes, but we cannot realistically get those rare nodes early on. And the 10% damage multiplier to crowd control of vulnerable enemies is very good. So I'm going to pick this one because we are also going to grab a lot of different points in the next board. So the next board is the Earth and Devastation. I'm currently pathing through this one. So I want this glyph slot with the glyph that increases our damage based on the fortify we have. So the more intelligence we get in this range, the more damage increase we get. We get conditional crit damage with earth skills. We get resistances, which is useless. And then we path through here to grab the Earth and Devastation. This one doesn't apply to bosses, but basically every other enemy in the game is going to get a 30% increase, a 30% multiplier to all the damage we deal with earth skills. So this one is very strong to have, despite it not applying to bosses, except for the stagger phase. But we burst on enemies anyway, so the stagger phase is mostly not going to proc. And then we get this oppress node here with all those increases. Damage versus crowd controlled, we are always hitting crowd controlled enemies. And damage, crit damage versus crowd controlled, same thing. So this finishes up the board. We fill up a few things. You can find the Paragon board down below in the talent planner. This one is basically already very optimized. So there is a little bit here you can grab, but I think having a split damage with those nodes is a little bit better. Anyway, I will follow up with a better gear setup with this build and will showcase it at higher gear levels and higher nightmare difficulty once I get there. I haven't found the Tempest Raw helmet, so I'm basically stuck with my Lightning Storm builds. The next video I'm going to go over offensive stats and how to gear your character, same with the defensive stats. So basically a masterclass to gearing, split into two parts, the defensive ones and the offensive ones, specifically for the druid, so you know what you can do with this class. And I'm going to check out a few builds other people made. I see Veins. I saw a request from a lot of you in my Discord that wanted me to check out a CRONE staff build. I found a few things that I'm not agreeing with, so I will have a look at that. Anyway, see you next time and bye. Enjoy the gameplay.
Wait a moment. I'm not ready yet. I need time to do that. I'm not ready.